beneath the glow of Swarovski chandeliers, with classical symphonies echoing across the grand hall. She stood there, head bowed beside a $500,000 Steinway Grand Concert piano, her hand gently brushing away the dust, as if asking permission from the past to touch it once more. No one knew her name. No one stopped. Polished leather shoes, designer perfume, tailored suits, all walked past her like she was nothing more than an invisible stain in the air. She was just a cleaner, a background detail, a silent fixture in a space reserved only for those deemed gifted. If you really think you belong here, a smug male voice rang out in the hall. Then go ahead. Play something. Laughter followed. Not loud, but sharp. Sharp enough to sting. Sharp enough to drag up every time she had ever been silenced before she could even play a single note. Elena Hart looked up, not to protest, but because something inside her cracked open. It wasn't anger. It was the pain of being torn between two worlds, the world of those allowed to shine and those forever expected to bow their heads. She looked at the piano in front of her, as if seeing an old friend who had once walked away without saying goodbye. Her hands kept wiping, but her eyes glistened. No one noticed, or maybe they just didn't care. No one knew that when she was just 13, Elena once moved an entire room in a small Chicago theater with a jazz piece she composed while her mother lay in a hospital bed. No one knew she once had a full scholarship to France until her mother passed and life forced her to choose a mop over music. And now, after more than a decade, living in the shadows of her own silence, a single mocking voice in the hall of a conservatory had struck the chord of a melody long locked away. A melody not written in notes, but in memory, in grief, in loss, in the aching hunger to be seen just one more time. And so, in what seemed like the most insignificant moment, a silent storm of music began to stir. A single speck of invisible dust on a $1 million piano was about to make all of Astoria hold its breath. When the lights of Astoria dimmed and the final violin note faded into silence, Elena often walked through the North Corridor, a place few ever ventured, where damp, old brick walls offered a kind of breathing space far more comforting than the grand, gold-trimmed hallways. There in the quiet she listened, not to people, but to the echoes trapped in stone, the unfinished piano practices, half-played melodies drifting from behind the concert hall walls. She never saw a soul, but music always found its way to those who truly needed it. Quietly, faithfully, like a forgotten friend. Elena once lived with music, not in the sense of training for competitions or dazzling audiences. She lived inside music, slept in it, breathed it. As a child, she used to play the piano for her mother after long, grueling night shifts at the hospital. The first piece she ever composed was during one of those nights, when her mother lay unconscious from chemotherapy. It wasn't really music, it was a prayer, a desperate cry. She didn't know how else to speak. Her final performance was also the last time her mother clapped for her from the back row. 3 weeks later, her mother was gone. The piano was sold. The scholarship was revoked. Her name was erased from every list. Since then, Elena never touched the keys again. Not because she forgot, but because she feared that touching those memories would destroy her all over again. 11 years later, she was a shadow inside the most majestic building in the music world. She arrived early, left late, and kept every surface spotless as if no one had ever walked there. Elena lived like a ghost. Until that morning, when a harmless speck of dust cracked her heart wide open. That evening, back in her tiny staff dorm room, Elena sat silently on the wooden chair by the window. Outside, New York never slept, but inside her, it had never really welcomed her to awaken. She looked down at her hands, hands that once dreamed of playing with orchestras, that once held promises from elite European academies. Now, they bore only calluses and the smell of cleaning agents. And yet, those hands still remembered how to curve around a chord. And for the first time in 11 years, Elena asked herself, what would happen if I touched the keys again? A gust of wind outside shook the white curtain against the pane. Inside, Elena placed her hands on the table, and her fingers began to tap a gentle rhythm, as if The music had never truly disappeared. It had simply been the right moment to be awakened. The next morning, Elena arrived earlier than usual. The first light of day streamed through the grand arched skylight, casting a soft golden trail across the marble floor, like the warmth in her mother's eyes long ago. But today, something inside her was no longer still. The invitation to the Whitmore competition was folded in the pocket of her coat, crumpled but never thrown away. The small print at the bottom of the page still read, "Each year, we grant one wildcard entry, reserved for someone not from the rankings, not from the elite, reserved for the forgotten voice." She stood before the concert hall doors, the same doors she had polished for years, wiping away dust and scratches on piano legs like a silent guardian. But this time, she wasn't there to clean. She was there to enter. She had no gown, no printed biography, no manager. All she had were 2 trembling hands and a piece of music no one had ever heard. "Are you sure?" A familiar voice called from behind. It was Jordan, the quiet security guard, the one who had once heard her play a single note and chose to believe in everything that followed. Elena nodded gently. No words came, but her eyes held a steady fire, not the kind that blazed, but the kind that smoldered quietly in the ashes, waiting for a single breath to ignite. In her hands was the application form, already printed by Jordan the night before. He placed it into her hands like a ceremonial offering, not from guard or worker, but from one soul to another, both seeing what the world had missed. As Elena stepped up to the registration table, she felt the eyes turning toward her, not because she stood out, but because she was too different, too silent, too unlike any of the candidates carrying Juilliard transcripts and resumes thick with elite credentials. "Name?" the woman at the desk asked, her voice faltering slightly as her gaze landed on the janitor's uniform. "Elena Hart," she replied, gently but with quiet certainty. "I'd like to try." They held eye contact for a moment. The registrar didn't smile. She only gave a faint nod and lowered her pen. "You'll go last." Elena turned away without looking back. Each step felt heavy, not from fear of failing, but because she carried something no one here had ever seen, a melody born from silence. Jordan was already waiting in the hallway. As she sat down in the waiting area, someone across from her smirked and muttered, "Maybe you're looking for the restroom? Or the new staff orientation?" She didn't answer. Because she hadn't been there today, she hadn't been accepted. She had come to play a sound this room would not be able to ignore. The concert hall fell silent, like a cathedral, when Elena's name was called. Every eye turned to her, not out of anticipation, but out of doubt, out of discord, because a woman in a janitor's uniform was walking toward a stage meant for child prodigies molded from birth. She walked slowly, as if each tile beneath her feet remembered being scrubbed by hands no one ever cared to name. But today, those very hands were allowed to touch the most sacred object on that stage, the piano. "The piece you've chosen is—" A woman's voice rang from the judges' panel above, cold and sharp like crystal. "I wrote it," Elena replied. A soft scoff came from the back. Someone chuckled. Someone shook their head, but she didn't look up. She looked only at the upright piano in the corner of the stage, aged, scratched wood, ivory keys yellowed by time, like it had lived through many forgotten stories. The head judge gave a nod, as if granting her a privilege. "If you're ready." Elena sat down, back straight, hands on the keys. She closed her eyes. No sheet music, no conductor's count in. Just breathe, in a silence, so long it became suffocating. Then, the first note. It wasn't loud. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. A low tone, steady like a heartbeat, bracing for pain. The second note trembled, but called back something hauntingly familiar, like a mother's voice in the kitchen or the sound of rain tapping on the window late at night. She wasn't performing. She was telling a story. Every note unlocked a buried memory, a shattered dream, a silent goodbye to music, a promise she never dared to speak aloud. At first, the hall murmured with whispers. But then, one by one, they faded. Eyes lifted, because they began to hear something that didn't sound like what they'd been taught to value. It wasn't academic. It wasn't polished. It was the truth. A melody not born from a page, but from floors scrubbed in tears. From nights spent dreaming of a stage she only ever saw through glass. And when the final note fell, no one clapped. Not because they disapproved, but because they had forgotten how to respond after witnessing a soul rise without permission. A long silence followed, so deep you could hear your own heartbeat. Then one slow clap, then another, and then everyone stood, not to applaud an artist, but to apologize for ever having doubted her. The concert hall still trembled as Elena stepped down from the stage. The lights hadn't fully dimmed, but every gaze had shifted. Not probing, not skeptical. Just one thing remained: awe. Jordan was waiting in the hallway corner, leaning against a column, arms folded as always, but his eyes were red. "I told you," he whispered, not to boast, but as a quiet reminder to Elena that she had just done the unthinkable. Behind her, the judges still sat, but this time their faces no longer masked. The male judge, infamous for his brutal critique, stood slowly and leaned in to whisper something to the one beside him. The young female judge, who had been taking meticulous notes all along, had stopped writing by the third note. Elena hadn't even made it to the door when someone called out, "Miss Hart, please wait a moment." It was Dr. Celeste Hanov, the head judge. Her face remained stern, but her eyes had changed. The judgment was gone, replaced by something close to empathy. Normally, we require time for the panel to deliberate. But she paused, glancing at the other two. They both nodded, almost in unison. "But in your case, no further discussion is needed." Celeste stepped forward. Her voice was calm, but resolute. "Elena Hart, as chair of the Whitmore Invitational, I hereby declare you the official wildcard contestant for this year." The room erupted, not from surprise, but because everyone knew they had just witnessed something rare. A soul stepping out from the shadows, asking for nothing, just playing her truth and making the world listen. Elena stood still. Everything slowed. The voices, the clapping, the rising wave of praise. It all reached her ears like distant ocean waves. And yet, she felt one thing with clarity. Her hands were still trembling, but not from fear. This time, it was because for the first time in 11 years, she felt alive. Then, from the crowd, a shy girl with curly hair stepped forward. She didn't speak. She simply held out a sheet of paper, covered in shaky pencil notes. At the top, in tiny letters, it read, "A piece I wrote after watching you play. I call it Begin Again." Elena knelt down, looking at the girl for a long moment, then softly said, "No one is born to be forgotten. Do you understand? And if the world won't listen, then we play until they have to stop and hear." 1 week after the audition that shook the halls of Whitmore, Elena stood in practice room 3, the same room where she once mopped floors and arranged chairs for rehearsal sessions. Now, her name was printed on the official schedule, clear and bold. Elena Hart, wild card finalist. But outside that line of text, a storm was quietly brewing. A video of her performance had surfaced online. No one knew who uploaded it. It was raw, unedited, and without context, and it spread like fire through silk. The janitor who taught an orchestra what emotion really sounds like. The Invisible Woman's Melody. A question for Whitmore. Do you choose technique, or do you choose truth? Headlines poured in. Half the public hailed her as a miracle of a new era. The other half, suspicious. Who is she? Why has no one ever heard her name? Is this a publicity stunt by the Academy? How can someone without formal training stand among the best in the industry? Elena read every comment, not because she wanted to, but because it's impossible to look away when the world suddenly revolves around your name. The dreams came back, old ones, of her mother, of empty recital rooms, of broken keys beneath fingers soaked in tears as she tried to finish melodies too painful to play. "Are you okay?" Jordan asked, finding her sitting alone in the dim practice room. The lights off, the single upright piano polished so well it reflected the corridor's glow. Elena nodded, but her hands wouldn't stop trembling, not from fear of failure, but because soon she'd stand before hundreds of eyes, not to prove herself, but to answer one question: would the world accept raw truth, or only what's been trained to sound agreeable. That night, before the final performance, Celeste came to see her. Not as a judge, but carrying a small wooden box. "This belonged to my sister," she said. "She never got the chance to stand on stage. The world didn't have space for a voice that didn't quite fit." Elena was still as she opened the box. Inside was a silver hairpin, carved with musical notes. "Simple, but delicate. I think you'll know how to return it to the stage the way it was always meant to be," Celeste said, placing it in Elena's hand before turning away. She paused, then added one last message over her shoulder. "Don't play to protect yourself. Play like you've got nothing left to lose. That's when music becomes its most powerful." Elena stood alone before the mirror, hair pulled back, hands resting on the piano. She was about to walk onto that stage, not as someone who once cleaned it, but as someone who would make sure it never forgot her name. Final night. Astoria Concert Hall had never gleamed brighter. The Swarovski chandeliers cast their glow over the room like an artificial night sky, dazzling and vast. The audience was filled with the titans of the industry. Artistic directors from Europe's grandest theaters, notorious critics from the Times, Pulitzer-winning composers, and, of course, every major media outlet. The red carpet welcomed each finalist like a rising star. Glittering gowns, hand-stitched tuxedos, every detail planned months in advance. Except for Elena. No stylist, no entourage, no backstage light crew. She dressed herself in a simple black dress borrowed from the Academy's old costume room, and wore worn leather shoes, scuffed but steady. In her tied-back hair, a silver hairpin, a gift from Celeste's sister, carrying the weight of a dream that never reached the stage. She stepped out from behind the curtain like a silent breeze. Yet despite the hum of the room, a hush fell slowly, as if a chill had swept through the hall. Not because of how she looked, but because something about her presence wasn't part of what they'd prepared to witness. Celeste sat in the front row. No clipboard, no notes. She looked up at Elena, not as a judge, but as someone silently proud, though never openly said. Jordan stood by the sound booth. No camera, no phone, just clenched fists and eyes locked on her. Elena sat down before the Steinway and Sons grand piano, the very one she'd spent 11 years cleaning, never daring to imagine she'd ever sit there. There was no sheet music, no metronome, only her and the keys like two old friends meeting again, bearing the weight of everything they had never said. She placed her hands on the keys, closed her eyes, exhaled, and then music, not a familiar melody, not Chopin, not Bach. It was Elena, a piece never written, never rehearsed, never planned. Each note felt like a shard of memory stitched together, at times soothing like a lullaby, at others jagged like rejection. Sometimes it sang like a love song. Sometimes it sobbed like all the nights she cried alone in the Academy corridors. The piano didn't just follow, it responded. It trembled. It broke. It breathed. At one point, when the audience thought she was done, Elena lifted her hands, not to end, but to begin a moment of improvisation, a raw burst of soul. It was forbidden in a classical competition like Whitmore. But Elena wasn't playing to win. She was playing to live. She played as if the audience were mirrors reflecting every night she had ever been forgotten. And then, the music faded. No dramatic finale. No closing chord. Just a final note, left hanging in the air, like a question that was never meant to be answered. Elena opened her eyes, looked up. No one moved. The entire room held its breath, as if a single motion might shatter what had just happened. Then someone stood. The young female judge. Then Jordan. Then Celeste. And then the entire hall erupted. Not the usual applause, but an eruption of hearts that had just been broken, then healed. A veteran critic wept openly. A young composer gripped their partner's hand. And an elderly audience member at the very back whispered, "I don't know who she is, but I just came back to life." After that night, everything changed. The New York Times called Elena the storyteller of the keys. Classical Today described her performance as a rebirth of raw emotion in musical art. The hashtag Elena Hart flooded social media, becoming a new symbol of music without boundaries. Music that didn't seek medals, only truth. Elena still lived in her old apartment, still walked the same familiar alleyways, but each step no longer echoed in silence. On her way to the practice room, strangers stopped to thank her. A young boy handed her a handwritten score. A mother told her that because of her, her daughter had returned to piano lessons after 3 years of giving up. One early morning, Whitmore held a tribute, not in an auditorium, but right in the school courtyard. Students, professors, even maintenance staff stood in a circle to hear Elena play an unnamed piece on the same upright piano she had once been told to stay away from. When the music ended, the entire courtyard fell into silence. No one said a word. They simply placed their hands over their hearts, because in that melody, everyone had seen a part of themselves. Weeks later, Whitmore made an unprecedented announcement. Elena Hart would become the first ever artist in residence without a music degree in the Academy's 100-year history. She would teach a course titled Music, Memory, and Emotion. No curriculum, no textbooks, just a piano, stories, and the art of listening. On the first day of class, Elena entered the room. No blazer, no laptop, just a single sheet of music she had written the night her mother died in the rain. She opened the piano, played 3 notes, then looked up at the students. "If you came here to learn technique," she said, "the room next door is yours. But if you want to learn how to make a room fall silent, tell the truth." She paused, then added, "Music isn't meant to impress. It's what keeps you alive, when nothing else is willing to listen." That quote spread everywhere. It was printed on posters, quoted in panels, etched into the walls of Practice Room 3, once just a supply closet. The night before the National Music Festival, Elena returned to that room one last time. She placed her hands on the familiar key, now engraved with the name Heart's Hope. She didn't play a song. She simply sat there, hands clasped as if whispering thanks. Outside the window, snow began to fall, soft and steady, just like the rhythm of her life. Not loud, but every flake left a mark. After her Carnegie Hall performance, a reporter asked a little girl in the audience, "Who do you think she is?" The girl smiled and answered simply, "She's the one who proved, if you live your truth, the whole world will stop to listen." Elena Hart didn't just play a song. She rewrote what a stage could mean. And when she finally walked away, what echoed wasn't applause. It was your own voice, believing for the very first time that it, too, deserved to be heard. Some stories don't need spotlights or applause. They just need one person brave enough to stand up and speak the truth that the world chose to ignore. Elena Hart was once considered invisible, just a name on the janitor roster. But with hands that had never been formally trained, she played a piece that made an entire hall hold its breath. It made centuries of prejudice bow their heads. She didn't step on that stage to win. She stepped forward to remind us. Even the smallest voice, when it speaks the truth, can stop the world in its tracks. If you've ever felt like you weren't the right fit, if you've ever been overlooked, dismissed, or trapped in roles that didn't reflect who you really are, then this story was meant for you. Leave a comment. What truth are you still carrying that you've never dared to share? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel, because we don't tell stories about perfect people. We tell stories about those who dare to be honest, and through that, change the world. Because in the end, the most powerful music doesn't come from the most talented hands, but from the ones who have been silent the longest. And when they finally play, it's not just a melody, it's a reckoning. Music doesn't belong to the privileged. It belongs to those brave enough to play their truth, even when they've been told not to speak. Not everyone is born with a stage beneath their feet and lights overhead. Some spend their entire lives just trying to be seen, not as titles or labels, but as a human being carrying a dream that was never given permission to speak. Elena Hart proved that. A woman who quietly cleaned concert halls for 11 years, and then, with a nameless melody, made the elite fall silent, made critics cry, and made the world listen. This isn't just a story about music. It's a powerful reminder that you don't need permission to be worthy. You just need the courage to live your truth. And when that truth is heard at the right moment, It can break through walls that no one thought possible. The message Elena left behind was never about technique, fame, or awards. It was about truth, about turning pain, silence, and invisibility into a symphony that touched even those who once turned away. So if you, even once in your life, have been misjudged, have felt your dream was too late, too small, or not good enough, this story was for you. Subscribe to Toch Story for more true, emotional, and inspiring stories like this, where the most ordinary people carry the power to make the whole world stop and listen. Because sometimes, an old piano key, it is where an unforgettable revolution in sound begins.